political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody.
We have great fans. I want to thank them for being here.
The best line
so it's a great night for Nebraska.
The Nebraska Democratic Party is not going to have a sort of, burning bush moment where everything gets turned around in one election. That doesn't happen.
All right, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. I'm Mac McCoy, and this is a special edition of Point Counterpoint. My co-host, Steve, writes a lot of things that he's passionate about, and sometimes I'm not smart enough to get it. So he is going to be your host today, and give me the topic again so the listeners know.
Christian compassion being exploited.
All right, so we're going to get going. Steve, take it away.
Well, this could be called 59 minutes and counting because that's how much time I have. And basically what I'm trying to do is introduce the whole thing about Christian compassion under the terms of empathy and toxic empathy. And by toxic empathy, what I mean is, and I'm going to reference somebody that explains this really well, Allie Beth Stuckey. She's an American Christian conservative commentator, wrote a book called Toxic Empathy, How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion. And this is done by separating empathy from love. And what happens is that the conservatives, or rather the progressives, are trying to take what we know well, compassion, as Christians, and use that against us by creating certain changes in thought. They could be called cliches or slogans. And these modern political slogans seem almost impossible to challenge because it makes us sound unchristian, unsympathetic, non-compassionate. Now, these slogans are supposedly came from, and I think this is true, a gentleman written about by the name of Robert J. Lifton. He's a psychiatrist and expert on thought reform and brainwashing. And he identified this concept as TIFA, which is a formulated language key component of thought-terminating cliches within totalist environments. Now, what that means is that basically this came out of communist China. And communist China has learned how to take these different cliches, slogans, and use it to their advantage of controlling people. And these phrases are designed to restrict critical thought. Now, as you know, critical thought is essential in discerning Christian ways and how to live life. So what are TIFTA supposed to do? Well, they were invented to simplify complex issues into moral binaries. In other words, this is right, this is wrong, to the point that it's ridiculous. They're designed to embed ideological assumptions. They're designed to bypass rational analysis. Again, reason's important. They're designed to create social pressure among us to repeat the slogan, self-fulfilling. Signal loyalty to the party line, of course. In that case, it would be to the Communist Party. Here it could be other things. And delegitimize dissent by framing disapproval, or rather, by framing disagreement as immoral. So they start bringing the word immoral in a lot, and yet this is anything but moral. So how do these TIFAs work? Well, according to James Lindsay, on X, he explains TIFA uses emotionally charged slogans to confuse moral thinking and to corner people into agreement before they've even had time to think. So what they do, these things blur important distinctions. Like, for example, think of compassion over here and approval over here. Two different things. But they just blur that. Love over here, affirmation over here. Again, blurred. Human dignity over here, moral truth. Blurred. Making everything binary. Doesn't make sense, but they do it. Second, these slogans are rigged so that this disagreement doesn't just sound wrong, but heartless. So, in other words, if basically this type of slogan is designed to hijack our thinking, our brains. And they're done through mystification and rhetorical entrapment. Now, these two concepts are important to totally see how this works out, and I'll explain this as we go along. But the mystification part is the process of using very carefully constructed falsehoods. They're presented as truisms that undermine the critical thinking process. So, something that might seem it's obviously true in one way may be disguised and may look false. For example, and this is a good example, Black Lives Matter confuses people through misplaced compassion. Of course, lives matter, but does it mean that only Black lives matter? Why do we even bring up Black lives? Well, it must be a racist concept. And pretty soon, you got people jumping on the bandwagon without thinking what it really does mean, without knowing what it means, and pretty soon they're off to the races, and everybody's suffering. So another example, and this is really much better, is nobody is illegal on stolen land. Wow. This is smuggling the whole ideological worldview in the mind of the listener. For example, nobody is legal confuses the distinction between being a human being and basic dignity. In other words, what does that mean? Nobody is illegal. Well, okay, that's like saying nobody is not human. Nobody is illegal. That's confusing, isn't it? Well, first of all, it's not true. Secondly, stolen land makes it sound like there's no legitimacy of the country in question. So if we're a place of stolen land, immediately the United States must be a terrible place, taking everything that belongs to other people. It's planting that seed. And then taking that stolen land and then taking it distinct from the land itself makes it sound like there's a bridge between legality and legitimacy. So in other words, what they're doing is making it sound like the land we have here, the United States has illegally, and they're trying to say who are legitimate people here on legal land that they're illegal on stolen land. And pretty soon it sounds like we're the bad guys, our government's doing everything wrong, and these people are right. And it's just the opposite of what it is. Now, these rhetorical entrapments we talked about, just briefly mentioned, they have two rhetorical traps. And what happens is they dare us, in the use of this example again with illegal, because they challenge us to have to defend that. And they do it with an immoral assertion. So in other words, they say it in such a way that it sounds like they're morally correct. And if we say anything in opposition to it, it makes it sound like we're immoral, don't have empathy, not compassionate. It lures us into litigating the legality of an established truth, or in other words, they're taking the authority away from us. This is our land, this is our government, and they're saying, no, it isn't legitimate at all. It's planting that thought. So all these mobs that you get going, jumping around, doing all these things, this is a lot to do with Tifa. And what impact? Well, the impact is quite bad, because what happens to the normal people, most of us, in the silent majority, if you will, the only way you can respond to this normally without giving a lot of thought is either showing ignorance of what they are saying, or being chauvinistic. Well, we aren't that. We're not colonizers. We're not conquerors. And so it basically hijacks capacity to understand the situation correctly, and therefore it misleads people. And how do you debunk it? Well, the best way we can debunk it is to be strong in our Christian faith, In other words, do what we say we're going to do, prove we do it, and go on. But so, yes, I am implying something. If you're wondering, I am implying that this foreign-born thing has invaded the United States. And it really started back in the 60s when just about all the leftist activism became really run on a maleist Marxist engine. And I'm talking about the left. And they use this as a form of rhetorical and political warfare. This is what's so dangerous about it. This isn't by accident. This is intentional. And why I bring it up in a Christian program is because they're targeting Christianity because it represents the most formidable force against it, period. Now, it's very hard to combat some of this. I know Allie Beth Stuckey said she doesn't deny the dignity of immigrants. She makes that clear, or others going through gender dysphoria or whatever, but refuses the false binary akin to Anakin in Star Wars. Remember that? He was the one that said, when he became a bad guy, he said, "You're either against me or you're for me." That's the false binary. So you're either compassionate, you're not compassionate. You're either empathetic or you're not. They force us in these positions where we can't win. Because if we say one thing, it goes this way. So they plant this. Now, when you get into this, then, why does this even matter, or how does this happen? Well, there's a term called cognitive offloading that is really part of the human condition. It's a hidden mechanism behind mind and cult control. We naturally want to offload mental effort into something, enabling some kind of problem-solving, decision-making narratives, etc. Now, slogans are also used, and slogans are very efficient but dangerous, because a slogan becomes a cognitive shortcut, and it becomes a replacement for thinking, analyzing, and reasoning. Well, you can imagine, in our world today, if you lack thinking, analyzing, and reasoning, you're going to be very manipulative. You're going to be very easy to channel where somebody wants you to go. And trouble is, people want to think well of themselves, so the slogan becomes part of their identity. And keep in mind that this concept, TIFA, is not designed to clarify. It's meant to bewilder, disarm, and reprogram. It has Satan written all over it. There's just no other way to describe it. It's pure evil. So what happens here is these Christian teachings that we have, TIFTA, is working against us. And I'll give you examples right now that can kind of help you understand this. These are TIFAs being used right now. Silence is violence. Believe all women. Diversity is our strength. No justice, no peace. Love is love. Black Lives Matter. Nobody is illegal in stolen land, not to repeat myself. Decolonize everything. Trust the science. Trans women are women. Abortion is health care. No human being is illegal. So all these things sound good, and it makes it sound like if you have dissent against it, you're immoral. Now, the trouble with this, it bypasses debate. It creates social pressure, substitutes emotion for reasoning, and functions as a moral identity badge. So in other words, it's almost its own religion, which is the very point. And, we had talked about on the other side of things, A View from Pew, about anti-Christ. Well, this is a forerunner of it. It's got all that written all over it. Now, immediately, if you disagree with one of these TIFAs, it's because disagreement is immediately reframed by the left as hatred, cruelty, or a lack of empathy. That makes Christians appear hypocritical, because Christians are being told that the faithful response to a cultural conflict, which this is to find a third way, lower the temperature, avoid polarization, and speak with more nuance. Now, the trouble with that is these are all traps. And as a result of that, how do we react? Well, TIFA thrives on speed. Don't think, just react. So slow down. Ask yourself, what is this slogan assuming? TIFA moralizes disagreement. Ask instead, is this actually objectively true? TIFA demands immediate emotional allegiance and often appeals to tribal allegiance. Respond with disciplined Christian love grounded in reality and truth. Don't just take something said in a certain way and think it's true, especially when people yelling and screaming and emotions or riding above reason. So the progressive's intent in using TIFA is to make it sound, well, first of all, it's to stop us from thinking well. Discerning is important, but they're trying to get us not to discern. And then they're framing this as empathy equals Christianity. So if we resist what they call empathy, or what we think Christian is, and they say we are cruel. Now, this gets pretty tough for us, because then if we keep going on with that and we say, well, immigration, abortion, gender ideology, they're accusing us of, you don't care. That's entrapment. You don't care means you're not compassionate. It means you don't have any empathy. So therefore, we're caught. And that's exactly where they want us to be. Now, there's no truth behind this rhetoric, far from it. It's a war on empathy. It's just the opposite. They're trying to overwhelm our critical thinking and blind us to moral clarity. And that's really important, because that doesn't do any good. It doesn't provide balance. And how it doesn't provide balance is because misdirected empathy routinely produces injustice. Because misdirected empathy is imbalance, the very thing that we don't want. And so as a result of that, the less polarization they're asking for is actually theologically dangerous. And the reason for that is the gospel itself is a stumbling block. The problem is that we were never told that by Jesus that we are to avoid polarization. We were categorized, our Christian upbringing taught us to believe that clarity is good, but they turn it around and makes it sound like clarity is cruel. So if you go to Romans 12:2, Paul says that believers should resist conforming to the world's behaviors, that we need to discern. Discernment is work. It requires resisting emotional shortcuts. It requires doing more research on what's uncomfortable. We are not to assume what slogans say as being true and what they erase and ultimately doing harm. So a Christ follower doesn't trade objective truth for the appearance of compassion. Because if he does, he'll be absorbed in the world. We won't be compassionate at all. We'll just be part of the world misleading ourselves. So how should a church react? How should we react? Well, we've got to recover moral clarity. Mikhail Olson in the Christian Post wrote how compassion and justice are compatible. Now, according to Tifa, they are incompatible. He goes on to say that Christians are told not to choose between justice and injustice, but between biblical compassion and a counterfeit version that borrows Christian language while quietly rejecting Christian moral order. And that is what's happening. That is the forerunner of Antichrist again. And this is extrapolating, exploiting our compassion is to further their cause of diminishing Christian effect. So why is this being excused? I mean, why is this being, why doesn't more happen? Well, the problem is the far-left coalition is creating disruption intentionally. It's evil. They got the full support of the media, and they're trying to do the most damage they can to the people they want to do away with, and that's us. So we are being absolutely targeted by this. And so to get a little bit further into this, here's some more examples. The familiar progressive Christian refrain is stand with the immigrant. Lead with empathy. Now, trouble with this is Jesus would oppose that. This implies that if you support immigration enforcement, you're unloving. If you oppose riots or obstruction, you're complicit in injustice. But that framing is false. Now, here again, Paul in Romans 13 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad." In other words, rulers should be after the bad, not the good. If you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So what is Paul really saying? He's saying that the government is meant to be a terror to bad conduct, not the other way around. And in fact, this is one of the ways God restrains evil in the fallen world. So in other words, justice and love are not opposites, they are married. Love is to be ordered. Okay? We don't need abstract empathy. We don't need to invert it. But love that refuses to prioritize responsibility becomes cruelty dressed up as a virtue. So when did this inversion begin? Well, it started in the 20th century, and moral language was used as a revolutionary tool going back, believe it or not, to communism, Lenin. Because he wrote that objective good is not objective good, or morality is not good. It's a moral weapon. Morality is a weapon. And so he used that in terms of creating chaos, because chaos is his friend when you're breaking down social structure. So, in other words, it became a point of usefulness to use morality in a wrong way. So how does the strategy work? Well, first of all, you identify real grievances, you amplify them, you detach them from moral limits, and you weaponize compassion to destabilize institutions. This is using Christianity against itself, and it is evil to the core. And this is what's happening in the United States as well. We're just doing exactly the same thing. So we saw this most recently in 2020 with Black Lives Matter. Riots were justified as the language of the unheard. Boy, that's a slogan. The language of the unheard, violence. It's justified because cities are burned. Businesses were often burned as well and destroyed. And what's strange about that, a lot of times were the minorities who were having it happen. Laws were obstructed. Confrontation was provoked intentionally. Everything was framed as, any response was framed as brutality. No matter what the police would do, no matter what anyone would do, it was brutality. So the social media flooded with moral outrage. How can they do this to these precious people? So what if they were shooting at us? You should have been understanding. They had to have a reason. Churches were pressured to bless the narrative, to be branded unfaithful, to do anything else. The goal is not to reform, but to destabilize us. And of course, we all read about Minneapolis, and this is an example of this. This is not God's law in action. This is Satan's dismissal of law, very well manipulated. So when this happens, Jesus said, look, without law, trust evaporates. He was all about trust. He was all about order. He says, we don't want to be manipulated. He always talked about us being discerning people. He was for polarization. Those are the bad guys. Those are the Sadducees. These are Pharisees. They're not doing the right thing. He wasn't about accommodating each time. So every time these slogans are used, we're being manipulated. These emotionally charged, political weaponized things, and I'm not talking about moral reality. I'm talking not about in the scripture, but what's happening in the hands of evil people. So as a result of all this, we've got all kind of excuses for evil behavior, and we instead should be anytime tension is created for the wrong reason, we should have tension always between good and evil. But when we put tension between good people in the name of some ideology that's made up by man, it's evil, period. Now, what's happening today, to give you kind of a better idea how this is happening, it's this misdirected empathy is being attached to everything. One of the key ones would be abortion debate. You know, the life of the unborn child is treated as an abstraction, a complication, or denied altogether. Empathy is permitted to see one life clearly only by refusing to see the other life. What I'm trying to say is they're telling us, look, be compassionate for the mother. Save her life. Save her the embarrassment. Save her being off from work for 9 months. Abortion should be allowed. But never once is the life of the unborn ever talked about. Not one time is he being represented. Does that sound like God's plan? Does it? Ask yourself, does it really? So these policies are shaped by emotion. They don't have much to do with thinking. They have to do with the same underlying confusion that's being, basically what's happening in our society. Empathy has been elevated above truth rather than be ordered to submit to it. Empathy is to be submitted to truth, not the other way around. So what should we Christians be doing? Well, we got to be courageous. We got to confront destructive practices. We got to be tender, but we got to be courageous without being cruel. And we've got to have the wisdom of obedience. We've got to anchor ourselves in truth, in God's truth, His moral reality. So how this all comes down today is this. At one time, Christian worship was considered a crime. That's become a big deal now. And even beyond that now, being a Christian has become dangerous. Believers are being targeted for being compassionate when gathering, praying, or living openly as followers of Christ. Now, that's being compassionate, but we're being attacked for that because true compassion doesn't exist in evil. So silence emboldens people. Consequences deter. So that's where we all have to be more diligent, I should say. So how this all comes down to is you can even get into other things like I'm going to be totally political here now. So recently, Sharia law was debated in the Congress, and what happened was Robert Spencer spoke, and he said Sharia law is incompatible with the U.S. Constitution, and it's going to continue to clash. Now, he said, as derived from the Quran Sharia, it's inherently political, supremacist, expansionist, and violent. Well, that's pretty tough. Okay. So, and it's considered divine law. So, in other words, as I understand it, when you believe in Sharia law, that takes precedence over the law of the land. So obviously there would be conflicts. Now, unfortunately, I should say, there's quite a constituency of Muslim apologists. Many of them are found in the Liberal Party. So how do these politicians react at this hearing? This is most interesting. And this just happened recently. So while Spencer, who is an authority in this area, was citing an internal Muslim Brotherhood memo, talking about jihad and destroying Western civilization within and so on, Democrat members were pivoting for what they deemed as unnecessary, and they lamented the alleged influence of white Christian nationalism. Wait a minute, white Christian nationalism. They're talking about Sharia law, we're talking about freedoms, and all of a sudden we're into white Christian nationalism. And Democrat politician Jamie Raskin said the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment prohibits the government from creating an official church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he says it renders concern about Sharia in the U.S. irrelevant. And I quote, "We live in a country so great, we don't need this anti-Sharia and anti-Muslim legislation." He likened the imposition of Sharia law to Christian white nationalism that he said attempts to mandate the display of 10 Commandments and so on. Now, Christian white nationalism, this is a slogan again. What in the hell are they talking about? Christian white nationalism. So that's the point. You try to sidestep it. You try to make it a distraction. And that's what, Raskin was saying. It's becoming a distraction. They're trying to cover up things. They're trying to, with this white Christian nationalist ideology, that has nothing to do with it. And so Democrat Mary Gay Scanlon said that we should stop one religious minority, and he's referring to Christianity, attempting to impose its beliefs on the general population. What's this about? Nobody's doing that. Again, this is just a claim. Then she talks about how the Heritage Foundation, for example, has a manifesto. Well, a manifesto immediately is associated with communism. It's a negative thing. Remember Tifa? Okay. Hijacking moral instinct, shutting down critical thought, distraction, cover-up, one religious minority imposes its beliefs, manifesto. These are all examples of Tifa. So when Republican Brandon Gill was talking, there was snickering from Raskin, one of the Democrats, because he just making light of it. And all he was doing was citing that 39% of the Muslims in the U.S. believe Sharia law should be implemented in the country within the next 2 decades, and that 50% believe that everything here should be the national, let me rephrase that, 33% believe Islam should be declared as a national religion. Now, remember, this was just in the context that we shouldn't have any one religion take over, but flip the coin on the other side, and hey, that's okay. So, and then they snicker at it. Well, that isn't true. Of course, it's true. That's what that's saying. The polls are in. But we're going to cover the truth. We're going to cover what's going on, to minimize its impact. Divide and demean is really what was going on. So, if you keep going into this, this Christian nationalism is really an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civil life or civic life with a particular type of Christian identity and culture. That's not bad. That's what created America. That's what we are. So a lot of this, what they're trying to say, here's a liberal interpretation of it. They define conservative identity politics as the belief that identity itself, its elaboration, expression, or affirmation is and should be a fundamental focus of political work. Holy gosh, So what's happening, the left is using identity politics to infiltrate, and then they bring up oppression and such, where they can marginalize groups. So again, they can take off and running with these slogans. So the point is I'm trying to make here is there's a lot of things to be discerning about. Be really careful, because these things are really, here's an example where this identity can get so bad. I mean, where the left is using it. It dehumanizes people. It compels agreement. It makes people dismiss what they know is true, and it's void of critical thinking. So again, these stunts are just beyond. So here's something that was reported that I thought was very pertinent. Tyler Arnold reported in National Catholic Register about some different things being said by Democrats. And this is one. LaMonica McLeaver praised protesters for peacefully rejecting ICE's cruel agenda. Peacefully rejoicing. They weren't peacefully rejoicing. Cruel agenda. There was no cruel agenda. Again, these are slogans. Then she added, what are you going to do in Judgment Day with so much blood on your hands? There's no blood on anybody's hands. They're causing a lot of blood. Then she said, do you think you're going to go to hell? Now, these are leading Democrats. I'm not saying leading like they're smart or good. They are smart, but they're using the smarts the wrong way. And then another Democrat, Delia Ramirez, said DHS was created to violate our rights under the pretense of securing our safety. Well, you'd have to unravel that one, but immediately everybody would emotionally say, my gosh, they're taking our rights. We got to have our safety. That's the whole point of these things. They're really dangerous. And then another great Democrat, James Tarlico, he says the Bible doesn't mention, he's running for election in Texas. he mentions that the Bible doesn't mention abortion or gay marriage. He denounces Christian nationalism, which he defines as the worship of power in the name of Christ and a betrayal of Jesus of Nazareth. Oh my gosh. Now, you want to know, his mentor is a guy that's down in a church, Presbyterian church in Texas, and he's been ordaining LGBT clergy. He says that God is non-binary, there's 6 biological sexes, and all these things that, again, are just meant to confuse us. So my point, and I thank Mac for allowing me to do this, but this whole business about compassion being used against us, and I think I did this easily under 59 minutes, by the way, is to point out to you, the listeners, and you, the thinkers, you, the Christians, and you, the Americans, all those that care about this country, that we better be very vigilant about what we let into our brains and real careful about the gateway of these thoughts, because thoughts can kill us, and these thoughts are dangerous. They're being implemented in front of us so blatantly, and yet we're caught up in it. And it's not our fault. We just have to be very diligent about listening. And that's about all I really have to say. If I talk too fast, I apologize.
Thank you very much, Steve. We will look forward to you coming back with the next part of this. Meanwhile, I want to thank our worldwide sponsors, Divine Truth Christian Store. And that's a .com if you're looking up something from the comfort of your home. Remember, it's a local family helping you with anything you need. And thanks for listening.